It's now my pleasure to introduce Zion Brewer. Zion, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Zion Brewer, and I'm a technical specialist on the Microsoft Office 365 for Education team and Microsoft US Education. Today's topic will be deployment overview, options and tools available for deploying Office 365 for Education. I am joined today by Jason Keefe, who will be fielding questions on the chat. And so please feel free to post a question and have it answered by Jason. Today's presentation is primarily geared for IT administrators, project managers, and the decision makers in your organization. What we are hoping to achieve is that we can help you to better plan and prepare for the release of Office 365 for Education, which will be available coming this summer. Some of the things that we'll talk about the tools, deployment options, different ways that you can plan and roll out an Office 365 for Education deployment. We'll cover various technical topics as well as some of the more organizational and planning topics as well. Start by talking about the deployment phases. You may notice throughout this presentation that a lot of the content looks very similar to what is available on the Microsoft Office 365 deployment guide. If you've already had a chance to take a look at that, good for you. And as I mentioned, you might be the ones that notice some similarities there. If you have not yet, I will provide some resources at the end that'll get you to that document. Starting out with your Office 365 deployment, some things to think about would be deployment schedules. It's an important aspect to the planning and rollout of your deployment. In this presentation, we're going to follow into the initial planning stages. And so some of the tasks and topics involved there are planning for migrations, structuring and organizing a kickoff meeting, basically assembling and organizing your team, and making some key decisions about what deployment scenario you're going to follow through with, and making those decisions early so that you can better plan for what's coming later, for what servers will need to be deployed, for what scenarios will need to be set up and configured. From a very high level, you can think of, it might be helpful to think of your deployment in terms of planning, preparing, and migrating. This session today, as I mentioned, is going to focus on the planning stages. One very useful tool for a successful deployment is a deployment planning checklist or template, a way to keep your project on track and organized. I'm not going to go through this list line by line, but it might be useful for you to come back and see as an example of some of the different tasks that are involved in an Office 365 for Education deployment. I do want to call out, though, it's very important to engage your leadership, stakeholders, knowledge workers, those people that have the skills and the creative thinking to be able to move your project ahead, as well as clearly defining your team roles, their functions, and who's accountable for what task. Overall, having a clear picture of what's involved in your deployment, who's accountable for which part, and what the interrelationships between these many moving parts is going to help you have a successful deployment. So we'll move on into discussing in discovery being identifying the key aspects of your on-premises environment that might dictate and drive some of the different deployment options that you have down the road. So some of those Key points to focus on in your on-premises environment might be, how do your users plan, or how do you plan to have your users authenticate to the service? What kind of Active Directory do you have set up on premises? Will you have a complex mail routing scenario, or will it be more simplified? Many of these topics here we're going to cover from a high level in this presentation today. But it's a good idea to take a closer look and start thinking about some of these things now. Many of the pointers and guidance that we're going to provide in this presentation today can be done in advance of the availability of Office 365 for education. So that's a key thing to consider here. What can I do now to get ready for when it is available? Have yourself further along down the path to deployment. So I wanted to point out the Deployment Readiness Tool is an excellent tool available from Microsoft for investigating your on-premises environment. It's very useful in this discovery task. It can, for example, provide reports and detailed information about on-premises Active Directory, Exchange Online, the compatibility between your on-premises environment and Office 365, essentially. It will report on how many user objects it finds in your on-premises environment, for example. It'll tell you if there are some prerequisite steps that have not been met and how you might remediate those problems. Another useful tool is the MAP tool. It's the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. Very similar to the Deployment Readiness tool. However, it's an agentless. Again, it provides reports for readiness of your on-premises environment, such as servers and software that's installed, services that are running. Essentially, it's a tool that may help this simplify this discovery process and make your project faster and easier to deploy, to get off the ground. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about pilots with Office 365 for education. As part of the evaluation of the service, it's a very good idea to conduct a in-production pilot with real production users. You might, for example, have 20 users that you move to test the various services. Maybe you want to have some doing email, some doing link online. Pilot's a very good way to identify potential problem areas and feature gaps with the service and in your on-premises environment. I do want to point out, and you'll see it here in red, that currently there is no pilot available for Office 365 for education. You can open up an Office 365 for Enterprises demo. Office 365 for Enterprises and education are essentially the same service offering. They're very similar. I want to point out, and I can't stress this enough, if you do set up an Office 365 for Enterprises demo environment, enroll a test domain and use a different company or school name when you set up for that pilot. Those pilots cannot be transitioned into production environment. You have to think of them as being throwaway. When you're done with them, they're gone. We're hoping that after the general availability of Office 365 for education, you will be able to enroll in a demo that can be converted into production. But again, I'd like to point out it's not currently available today. So if you do enroll in an Office 365 for Enterprises pilot, please do not use any of your information that you plan on, domains in your company name that you plan on using in production environment. So I'm hoping that this list will be very useful to you in planning for your Office 365 for Education deployment. Essentially, I want to highlight some of the items that typically that we've seen can be associated with very long lead times. Different tasks and configurations and deployment options that tend to extend the project out longer than you may have expected. So for example, if hardware or software is going to be required, how do you get that software? What's the typical turnaround time for purchasing a new server if that's what needs to happen? I would also like to call out preparation of Active Directory on premises. AD cleanup is an essential part of some of the deployment options, such as single sign-on and directory synchronization. Those various tasks can involve different groups throughout your organization, and it's necessary that you plan ahead so that it doesn't come up later and drastically delay your project. One of the most important considerations here is the on-premises operating systems, various workstations, servers, etc. As I mentioned, some of these items can take a long time to get remediated. I'm not going to go through this whole list here. Just call out that, Office 2010 and Office 2007 are required to use Exchange Online. Various browsers are supported. I think a majority of the browsers are supported, but there are some incompatible browsers. For example, browsers that are a quote-unquote light version, such as some of the Safari browsers or various other browsers that you find on mobile devices. One of the longest lead time items with an Office 365 for Education deployment is data migration. So this is a very busy slide, but hopefully it'll be useful to you as a matrix, something to come back to later, to have a quick overview of some of the different data migration options that are available from various source email systems. One that I'd like to point out is the Staged Exchange Migration tool. So that's a specific data migration tool that's available with Office 365. That tool does not support Exchange 2010 on premises. It does support 2003 and 2007. Now, one thing that you won't see on this particular slide is the hybrid deployment scenario. That's where you have an Exchange server, an Exchange 2010 server on premises, and you have a rich integration between your on-premises environment and Exchange Online. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the hybrid deployment options later, but it includes data migration as well. So next I'd like to talk a little bit about the networking and naming in your environment. That would be your DNS records, essentially planning for third-party SSL certificates. With Office 365, you can add your existing domains into the service, and based on what different services you are subscribing to, you might use those in different ways. So for example, with Exchange Online, if you have contoso.edu as your primary namespace, you can have mailboxes in both places using that primary domain. But when doing that, there are some important decisions and planning that you need to consider in advance of that. So when you add a domain to Office 365, it requires that you verify the domain by creating a DNS record in your external DNS. And so I thought I'd point this out because you may have a different group or team that manages your external DNS, or you may have your DNS hosted with your domain registrar or DNS hosting provider, and you will need the user account and password to be able to create these DNS records. You have to be able to manage your DNS records to be able to use them with the service. Also, in some scenarios, in some situations, SSL certificates are required. So for example, if you're going to be doing single sign-on with ADFS or hybrid deployment, it might be required that you purchase a SSL certificate, one or many SSL certificates. Office 365 supports wildcard certificates and subject alternative name certificates, SANs. I think those kinds of multi-name certificates, our recommendation is to use a SAN certificate. Another thing to consider with certificates is they do expire. So in your discovery and documentation, make sure to note when those certificates expire and when you will next be required to take action on those certificates. So if you have a certificate that's tied up with single sign-on and Exchange on premises, just be sure to know when it expires, because at that time you may need to take some action there. Another important part of the network planning is, well, first planning for the fact that Office 365 is an internet-hosted solution. So a lot of the traffic that used to be, that maybe used to be managed on premises in your local area network is now being transmitted over the internet. So that's very important to realize, that your WAN or internet connection becomes a primary critical path single source of failure for many of the services, many if not all of the services. Now that may not be that different from what you're doing now. Let's say you host Exchange on premises. If your internet connection is down, you may not receive emails. However, in comparison, in that scenario, if a user is on premises, they might still be able to connect to their mailbox and see their contacts and their old email, because that Exchange server in your on-premises environment on your LAN is still up and running. In this scenario, when your WAN is down, your internet is down, your users are not able to access the services. Another important thing to point out is that Office 365 uses FQDN DNS domain names for many, if not all, of the services. So when configuring firewalls and content filters, you might check now to see if they support wildcard certificates or URLs in their configuration. In some cases, it is possible to whitelist or pass IP addresses. However, it's not recommended. There are several hundred different IP addresses that our service uses, and it can be difficult to configure devices and keep up with the changing environment of those IPs. So if possible, use DNS domain names. Probably the more important consideration, though, is estimating your internet usage, your bandwidth, your capacity in advance of going live with Office 365. So one tool that's available is the Exchange Client Network Bandwidth Calculator. It's a mouthful, but I've posted a link to the download there. It helps you build profiles for various users and estimate how much of your internet bandwidth the Exchange online service is going to use. There are various other tools for the different services as well, such as SharePoint and Link. There's really no substitute here for real-world testing. And so I would recommend, in advance of your deployment, to test the various load scenarios. At peak capacity, how does your internal network and your external network perform? And try to make some estimates there about what might need to be planned for, new devices purchased, or et cetera. So I've talked a little bit about user identity and account provisioning. So the question this is meant to answer or help you answer is, how would I like my users to authenticate to the service? So from a very high level, there are three options. A separate sign-on scenario is where your users need to manage two separate sets of credentials. So they might have a username and password that gets them into on-premises resources, and they might have a separate username and password for the Office 365 service. I guess in that case, they could have the same username but different password. Another option might be a same sign-on scenario. And what I mean by same sign-on is that behind the scenes, the two identities are separate. They have a username on premises and a password on premises. That combination gets them into on-premises resources. And they have a username and password in the cloud in Office 365 that gets them into those resources. However, using something like a password synchronization tool allows those credentials to be the same so that they don't have to remember additional passwords. They're always using the same sets of credentials. I want to point out that Office 365 does not currently support password synchronization. So if you decide that that's your best choice and the path you'd like to go down, you would be required to investigate third-party software solutions for doing password synchronization. And then finally, there's the single sign-on federated identity scenario. In this case, users who are trying to access services in Office 365, that authentication piece is actually redirected to your on-premises Active Directory. So in that case, there's a user created in the Office 365 service, but there's no password. It's not stored in the cloud, and it doesn't authenticate to any cloud directory. It authenticates directly to your on-premises Active Directory and ADFS servers. I'm going to talk a little bit more about single sign-on. It's one of the more advanced and complicated deployment scenarios, and so I'm going to cover it a little bit from a high level. If you think that that is the path that you'd like to go down, it would be a very good idea to get started as soon as possible on deploying ADFS servers and getting up to speed on the various deployment options and terminology and how that service works. But again, I'll talk a little bit more about it later. So I think it would be useful to kind of highlight some of the pros and cons associated with the different user authentication scenarios. So on the far left, you see that's the separate sign-on scenario where users have to manage on-premises credentials and credentials for Office 365. In this case, it's one of the easier deployment options, and it requires minimal effort by your IT admin staff to roll that out. There aren't any servers, for example, required to be deployed on premises. Some of the drawbacks there is it doesn't support single sign-on. It doesn't support two-factor authentication or some of the more advanced user access control scenarios. And as well, the identities are not mastered in the cloud, which what I mean by that is you would have to create your user accounts in some other way because you're not using the directory synchronization tool in this case. So a middle option is you can combine that separate sign-on scenario with using DirSync. Essentially what that gives you is the ability to provision and manage user accounts with them having separate credentials. That will enable some simple coexistence scenarios. It quite dramatically simplifies the configuration of a shared address space, for example. The DirSync tool creates and manages the kinds of objects that you need for those scenarios to work. And then finally, the federated identity with DirSync, so that's a single sign-on scenario. In this case, your password policies, your user passwords are stored on premises. There is support for two-factor authentication. Many of the rich coexistence scenarios and hybrid deployment rely on this single sign-on scenario, and it's required. But I do want to point out one of the biggest considerations when deploying single sign-on is that your on-premises Active Directory and Internet connection become a single point of failure for all of your users in the service. So it is essential to plan for and configure high availability for those servers and those services. I want to quickly highlight some of the user account provisioning options. So I mentioned a little bit about directory synchronization. I'll talk more about that in some detail later on. It's also possible to provision user accounts using PowerShell. You can create your own scripts and your own provisioning service if that is what you desire to do. I would say the complexity is moderate to high for doing so. And if you're going to be managing your user accounts in a separate sign-on scenario, all hosted, you can do bulk imports, and you can also create accounts one-off in the Microsoft Online Services portal. All right, and as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit more about single sign-on with Office 365, what it is and how it works. I think for the most part, it's self-explanatory. There's one set of credentials that a user must manage, and this single set of credentials allows them to access multiple services. So single sign-on with Office 365 is not just browser only. It's available for rich clients and different connection scenarios. So single sign-on works with SharePoint Online, Lync Online. It works in the browser, and it works in rich email clients and mobile devices. Single sign-on with Office 365 is based on ADFS 2.0. It's Active Directory Federation Services. Essentially, that is a web service that sits in an IIS server on your on-premises environment. That web service is responsible for passing security tokens between your on-premises environment and Office 365. Now, that's a very high-level, simplistic explanation of what ADFS is and does. And I would encourage you to start to dig a little bit deeper now. And if you think that single sign-on is going to be the deployment option that you're going with for authentication, learn as much as you can about it now, because it is complex and it is a critical path, single point of failure for the service. Some of the requirements and limitations. ADFS supports only a single Active Directory forest with a Windows 2003 domain controller environment and forest functional level. If you do have a multiple forest scenario, we would encourage you to consider consolidating those forests down into one. Or you could consider deploying for user accounts in your primary logon forest only. There are some various options available, but currently it is only a single forest supported scenario. It does support multiple UPNs, however, so if some of your users are in contoso.edu and other users have a UPN in fabricam.edu, a single ADFS server farm scenario might support that. ADFS requires Windows Server 2008 and or 2008 R2. It is a free download that is available from the Microsoft download site. I have to point out that it is ADFS 2.0 that's required. It also might require some remediation, hotfixes, patches to be installed on client workstations. Office 365 has what's called the desktop setup tool, which if you can use that, it kind of simplifies the process of updating those workstations. It'll install hotfixes and the required patches and registry changes, as well as the Microsoft Sign-In Assistant. You might also be able to push some of those out with System Center Configuration Manager. Some of the other requirements for single sign-on are third-party SSL certificates, Windows PowerShell 2.0 to be able to configure the ADFS service, and you use PowerShell to create a relying party trust relationship with your on-premises environment and the Office 365 service. Essentially, you're creating a secured path for this token exchange between the two environments. Here's a pretty high-level diagram demonstrating how it works. You have Active Directory and ADFS servers on premises. Those services are used to pass authentication tokens to the Office 365 service, and users are then enabled, granted access into the various services. Some of the benefits of single sign-on are policy control, password policies, workstation restrictions. All those things are controlled in your on-premises environment. Allowing your users to have the same credentials for on-premises and the hosted services, can reduce support calls. It can simplify it. I think one of the primary issues is for security. So passwords are not stored in the cloud; they're only stored on premises. And as well, it supports two-factor authentication if that's something that you're interested in for web clients. I want to point out that single sign-on, the user experience varies across the different Office 365 services, and it varies with your configuration, what type of workstation a user is connecting from, what operating system, is it domain joined, is it not domain joined. This is an important consideration because in some scenarios a user will be required to provide credentials, whereas in others they won't. So a domain joined PC, for example, that's inside the network in your on-premises environment, or that is external, but it's a domain joined PC, may not be required to provide credentials for all the various services. However, non-domain joined PCs might, and most likely will. In most cases, many of the rich clients that your users will be using to connect to these services can store credentials. So with Outlook, for example, Outlook 2010 allows you to store the user name and password for mobile devices as well. So they won't be continually prompted, but there will be a single prompt once. And they might be prompted again if they update or change their password sometime down the road. In planning for ADFS, I'd just like to point out that because it's a critical part of your server infrastructure, there are some relatively high requirements for hardware and software. It can be virtualized, but you need to keep in mind the requirements here and make sure there's available resources for the service. And then I thought I'd put a diagram of one of the more complex single sign-on deployment scenarios. It's complex, and it's also the recommended path. So we recommend that you have a federation server farm in your internal network that has 2 ADFS servers, and then a parallel set of servers out in a DMZ. These are your ADFS server proxies. It's also recommended to have load balancers and high availability internet connections, etc. So the key point here is that ADFS is critical, and it requires great due diligence in the planning and considerations for high availability. kind of just a reference. There are some checklists and deployment information available both in the Microsoft Office 365 community site and as well with the Microsoft Office 365 deployment guide. I'm not going to step through all of these. Maybe it'll be useful for you down the road, but you can find additional information there. So I'll talk a little bit more about hybrid deployment. Again, one of the more advanced deployment options, but it provides a great user experience for your end users and for you as an IT administrator. I'd like to highlight the difference here between a simple coexistence scenario and the hybrid deployment scenario. Hybrid deployment adds, over the simple deployment, the ability to have free, busy, and calendar sharing between your two environments. You can use the Exchange Management Console, the GUI, in your on-premises Exchange server to manage things such as the relationship between the two servers, and you can manage data migrations. Probably in my opinion, one of the biggest advantages of hybrid deployment is the ability to move mailboxes using an online mailbox moves in most scenarios, so that a mailbox can be pretty seamlessly transitioned and moved over to Office 365, and a user may not be the wiser. They can continue to use that and stay connected to their mailbox during the move. So some of the things that are added over just a simple coexistence scenario are the exchange sharing, mailbox moves, and options for advanced mail routing and secure transport of mail. Again, with this list, I'm not going to go detailed line by line. The idea is to highlight here that if you're going to be configuring Exchange hybrid deployment, it requires servers to be installed in your on-premises environment, and it requires configuration of these servers and potential upgrades to your existing environment. When configuring this hybrid deployment scenario, doing it manually, I believe I've heard it said that there's something like 56 or 60 individual steps that need to be configured. I wanted to point out that the hybrid configuration wizard that's available with Exchange 2010 SP2 simplifies quite dramatically the different configuration steps that are required to deploy a hybrid server in your environment. I think it takes it from 56 or 60 down to 6 or 7. Here's a pretty high-level diagram that shows some of the server roles that are required to be installed and configured in your on-premise environment for hybrid deployment. So you see the DirSync appliance, directory synchronization is required. An Exchange 2010 SP1 or SP2 CAS hub server is required for hybrid deployment. ADFS in this case is optional, but recommended because it provides a better user experience for end users and gives you some of those advanced controls that we talked about earlier in single sign-on. Moving on, we'll talk a little bit about directory synchronization and the DirSync appliance. What it is, what it does, how it works. In a lot of ways, this is one of the easier deployment steps because the DirSync appliance is just that. It's an appliance. It's a simplified version of FIM 2010, and it is meant to be installed and deployed quickly and easily. Essentially, it's a couple of steps to set up and deploy it, and it runs on a schedule, does what it's supposed to do, and you can essentially set it and forget it. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to point out it's a one-way synchronization from your local Active Directory to Office 365. It will synchronize things like user accounts, mailboxes, mail-enabled groups, contacts, security groups, etc. Basic architecture of how it works, as I mentioned, a one-way sync, so it reads your on-premises Active Directory. It reads into the Office 365 directory, and the DirSync appliance itself combines this information into its database and makes some decisions about what types of objects to create, what types of objects to change and update. So for example, if you change somebody's display name on premises, after DirSync runs, it'll make the corresponding change in the cloud side. So depending on which deployment options you choose, the directory synchronization may be required. So rich coexistence, for example, the hybrid deployment scenarios, DirSync is required in that case. For simple coexistence, I would say this is more recommended than required. A simple coexistence, a pretty basic shared address space scenario where you have mailboxes on both sides using the same primary email address, that can be done without DirSync, but DirSync simplifies it quite dramatically. The staged exchange migration tool requires DirSync. So directory synchronization needs to be activated in Office 365, or that migration tool will not even be available. That's the staged exchange migration tool. As well, for federated identity and single sign-on, DirSync is required. I'd like to point out that in your testing, if you activate and or deactivate DirSync, that can be done. So if you're just testing how it works, you can activate and deactivate. However, if you're in an in-production environment, it should be done with caution. Activating and deactivating DirSync changes the way DirSync functions, and actually it won't function at all anymore. If you deactivate it but then reactivate it later, the DirSync appliance needs to then go out and join these different types of objects together. And in most cases, it can figure it out. But in some cases, you might have objects that get munged and or incorrectly formatted, various other problems like that. So be careful when activating or deactivating. DirSync does not support multiple forests, so it's a single forest only, and it does not support scoping or filtering, so you cannot limit it to a specific OU or domain, for example. So talk a little bit about some of the features that it enables. So primarily, the DirSync tool is available for a unified global address list. Essentially, it's the idea of identity coexistence, where you can have your single Active Directory on premises be responsible for managing user objects across both your on-premises environment and the cloud environment. It also allows you to sync various data that's available in your on-premises Active Directory. So I'd like to call out the gal photo, for example. If you have a way for users to publish their gal photo into your on-premises Active Directory, the DirSync tool will synchronize that to Office 365. It's also primarily responsible for enabling and driving that application coexistence. So what I mean by that is the interrelationship and the interaction, interoperability between your on-premises servers and your servers that are hosted in Office 365, such as Exchange. On-premises can interact with Exchange Online, Link in SharePoint, etc. DirSync has both a hybrid configuration and a non-hybrid configuration. So essentially, when you have Exchange installed on premises, DirSync can be configured to look for those Exchange attributes in your on-premises Active Directory. So at the bottom, I have bolded and underlined it that it's recommended to have an Exchange server deployed and installed in your on-premises environment, but it's not required. The reason that it's recommended, as I said, is that, well, if Exchange is there, then the AD attributes, your schema is extended and those attributes are available for DirSync to use. So that enables you to sync conference rooms as conference rooms. It allows you to sync proxy addresses and security groups, as well as some of the more common basic attributes like department, office location, website, phone number, etc. Many of those attributes are only available within an AD schema that's extended for Microsoft Exchange. And some of the limitations, I talked a little bit about the DirSync tool. It's a single AD forest, and it synchronizes the entire forest and can't be scoped or filtered, as I mentioned earlier. So specific OUs or subsets of users or domains cannot be removed from DirSync scope. It'll sync the entire forest, no matter how big or small it is. DirSync as well does not have the password change notification service enabled for Office 365, so that's not an option. If you require password synchronization, that would be a third-party solution. By default, because schools are generally very large compared to many of the commercial or enterprise deployments, there is a limitation of 20,000 objects. However, that limit can be removed with a support call. So if you know that you're going to be above that, you might get started early, have that limit removed. I'd also like to point out that you cannot really configure DirSync for high availability. It doesn't allow for a farm of DirSync servers or multiple load balanced DirSync servers. With that being said, DirSync in most cases is not a critical path infrastructure item. If DirSync goes down, for example, users can still access the service even if you're using single sign-on. It doesn't have any interaction with your authentication scenarios of your users. What would be down, however, is user provisioning. So one important consideration would be if you have a near-time user provisioning system that relies heavily on DirSync, and that you may assess that risk a little bit higher and commit to more maintenance, better server hardware, connect more fully to the DirSync server if it is something that's critical for you in your environment. Quickly go through some of the prereqs. There's a 32-bit version and a 64-bit version of DirSync. It requires a forest functional level 2003 and above. The DirSync server must be, it cannot be a domain controller, and it must be a member server that has access to all the other domains in the forest. It requires the .NET Framework, Windows PowerShell, and the last two, in general, it's recommended to have this server in an access-controlled location, meaning in your locked server room somewhere. While the server may or may not be critical path in your environment, it is definitely there's a potential. Users can run amok, so it can do a lot of damage if improperly configured or access is not limited to that server. And as well, DirSync does not require any inbound internet access, but if you are using outbound internet access controls, then you need to take some extra steps there to make sure that DirSync has outbound internet access. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that DirSync is based on the Forefront Identity Manager FIM 2010. I guess that was not entirely accurate. The 64-bit version of DirSync is based on FIM. The 32-bit version of DirSync is based on the ILM Identity Lifecycle Manager 2007. Something I'd like to point out is that if you have more than 50,000 objects in your on-premises Active Directory, and DirSync is going to be synchronizing more than 50,000, it's recommended that you install DirSync's database to a separate full-blown SQL server. So by default, DirSync will install onto a SQL 2008 Express database. I think 50,000 is a little bit conservative. It could support more than that with the SQL Express, but our recommendation is a full-blown SQL server. I've highlighted some of the reasons why. SQL 2008 Express has a free downloadable version, has some limitations. It's only able to use a single processor. It's limited to 1 gigabyte of RAM, and the database is limited to 10 gigabytes. A full-blown SQL Server, on the other hand, does not have those same limitations. When sizing a server for a DirSync server, here's some general recommendations. I'd like to note if you have a very large school with lots of Active Directory objects, the resources required could be fairly substantial. So if you're looking at the 50 to 100,000 range, you might be looking at sizing a server with 16 gigabytes of RAM available to it. It can be a virtual machine as well. However, keep these resource planning considerations in mind. As I mentioned previously, DirSync runs on a sync schedule, and that schedule can be decided by you. I believe by default it runs every 3 hours. So it reads your on-premises directory every 3 hours, synchronizes changes. But in planning for your deployment, an important consideration might be the time it takes to synchronize DirSync for its initial sync. This is probably a rough estimate. However, something to keep in mind. So if you're looking at about 15,000 users, it might take 3 hours for that initial sync. If you're looking at 100,000 users, it might take 12 hours, 16 hours more. That initial sync in some cases can take a very long time, and it really depends on the size of your organization and some various other factors. The subsequent syncs, the delta syncs on the other hand, the ones that we'll be doing on a regular basis, usually happen very quickly because it's only synchronizing changes. Whereas in the initial sync, it can take a very long time because it might have to provision a lot of objects other than just updating them. So it's creating new versus just updating. So probably the most important thing that you can do to prepare for deploying the DirSync appliance is getting your Active Directory ready. So DirSync requires UPN suffixes, so if you don't currently use suffixes that are internet routable, for example, you might need to add a UPN suffix. That would be, let's say you're using contoso.local or contoso.com. As well, DirSync is used to create and also delete user accounts. So it's important to establish a user lifecycle process, delegate and decide who is responsible for managing user accounts, and have deliberate processes in place for how that's done. As I said, with DirSync, it can make changes on a very large scale, so that lifecycle process is very important. Another part is just, the most important part is to prepare your Active Directory. So you want to take a look at things like the minimum attributes and the optional attributes. Do you want to have those populated? Username, first name, last name, display name, etc. Those are required. There are various other attributes that might be available to you in AD, or especially if you have Exchange on premises. If you populate those attributes, they can be used in the service and they can be synced. In preparation for deploying DirSync, probably the most useful tool is the Deployment Readiness tool. And it's very important to, like I said, sanitize, validate the attributes that you have in your on-premises Active Directory. So hopefully this will be useful for you. Most of it is documented in either on the Office 365 community site or in the deployment guide. I'm not going to go through individually, but this kind of highlights some of the characters that aren't supported, some of the character length requirements, etc. One thing I wanted to point out is that your user's SMTP addresses, if you have Exchange on premises, those can be synced, but the domains need to be registered with the service. They need to be added to Exchange Online and Office 365. So as we come to the top of the hour, nearing the end, there's some additional deployment resources that I'd like to point out to you. This list is available in the Microsoft Office 365 Deployment Guide, and I put a link to that at the bottom. I think I've talked about just about all of these resources, maybe not the Exchange Server Deployment Assistant. That's a tool that is essentially it's wizard-based, and it gives you a kind of a step-by-step configuration of how you might configure your hybrid deployment scenario with Exchange 2010 on-premises or Exchange 2003 on-premises. There's also the assessment planning toolkit that I mentioned earlier, and the Office 365 community site. That's probably one that I'd like to highlight the most. There are various wikis, blogs, forums, question and answer scenarios that you can post a question, receive an answer from Microsoft support staff. And finally, there's not a lot of time left for questions. Thank you, Jason, for fielding questions on the chat. If there are any questions that we were unable to answer for you today, we're going to take a transcript of the chat questions and post some follow-up responses to our blog. That's the Microsoft Education in the Cloud blog. My team posts there regularly, and I've got a link to it down there for you. As well, the slides from this presentation should be available as a PDF document. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and hopefully this session was useful in helping you plan and prepare for Office 365 for Education's summer launch this coming year. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Zion. Appearing on your screen now is our survey slide. If you follow it down about halfway down the page, there's links that take you over to our feedback survey. We appreciate any feedback you give us. Please remember to hit submit at the bottom, and you may now disconnect from the audio portion of the conference. Thank you for joining us.